On May 15th, 2025,
But the
at
roadblock
Florida
doesn't
State
stop
Prison,
Glen Rogers.
after spending more
2
than
minutes
2
later,
decades
though,
on death
other
row,
troopers
Glen
do
Edward
by ramming
Rogers
his
was
car,
executed by
forcing him
lethal
off the
injection
road,
in Florida.
dragging him
His
out
case
moments later
marked the
at
end of a
gunpoint.
long and haunting chapter in American criminal justice. Glen Edward Rogers, born in 1962, Rogers earned a notorious reputation during the 1990s, when a cross-country killing spree ultimately led to his conviction and death sentences in both
Channel
Florida
9
and
videographer
California.
Chick Poppy
But that's
asking
only
him
part
the
of
question
the story.
on everyone's
The media
mind
dubbed
tonight.
him the Casanova Killer, a reference to the infamous Venetian lover from the 1700s, known for his charm and conquests. And like the original Casanova, Rogers had a way with women, using his good looks, confidence, and flashy spending to draw them in. But behind the charm was a predator. While officially convicted of 2 murders, Rogers claimed responsibility for as many as 70 killings
Moments
across
later,
the
as he was
United
transferred
States.
to another
Among those
trooper's car,
confessions was
I
an
asked an
explosive
angry
claim
Glen Rogers
that he,
the same
not
question
O.J.
again.
Simpson, was responsible for the 1994 murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. In one version of his story, Rogers said he had been romantically fixated on Nicole, but after she rejected him, he retaliated with violence. In another, he claimed he was hired by O.J. Simpson to break into her home and recover jewelry, only killing her and Goldman when they unexpectedly appeared. Authorities, however, dismissed these confessions, standing by their original findings and charges against Simpson. Still, what is undeniable is the terror Rogers inflicted in a short span of time. Between September and November of 1995, he murdered 4 women in 4 different
dragging
states,
him out moments
all
later
within
at
just
gunpoint.
6 weeks. He was cunning, but not exactly discreet. Rogers often used his real name when checking into motels. He even drove his victims' cars around for weeks after their deaths. His casual attitude made him harder to track, not because he was in hiding, but because he moved so freely and brazenly that few suspected the danger he posed. How did he slip through the cracks? What drove him to kill? And how many lives did he really take? In the fall of 1995, Glen Rogers' trail of terror moved west to the Van Nuys area of Los Angeles. That's where he met Sandra Gallagher, a married mother of 3 who was going through a rocky separation from her husband. Seeking a break from her troubles, Sandra went out for drinks with friends. That night, she crossed paths with Rogers. Charming and generous, he paid for Sandra's drinks and her friends, quickly winning her trust. By the end of the night, Rogers told Sandra he needed a ride home. She agreed, and they left together in her blue pickup truck. It was the last time she'd be seen alive. The next morning, hospital staff in the area noticed smoke rising from a nearby parking lot. A witness arriving early for her shift spotted a man with long blonde hair and a beard dousing the blue pickup truck in flames before fleeing on foot. Once the fire was extinguished, the horror became clear. Sandra's lifeless, badly burned body was discovered inside, but the fire hadn't killed her. The coroner later confirmed what investigators feared. She had been strangled to death before the flames ever touched her. Tracing Sandra's final hours, detectives went to the bar she'd visited the night before. Staff there remembered the man vividly. He'd been a regular over the past few days and introduced himself as Glen Rogers. When police searched Rogers' nearby apartment, they found personal items belonging to Sandra Gallagher. His name was immediately added to a nationwide wanted database, but by then, Glen Rogers had already vanished, and he wasn't done. Just weeks later, over 2,000 miles away in Jackson, Mississippi, Rogers resurfaced at the Mississippi State Fair, where he found work and met 34-year-old Linda Price, a single mother of 2. Their whirlwind relationship escalated quickly. With nowhere to stay, Rogers moved into Linda's apartment. At first, things seemed normal, but Linda soon noticed red flags. Rogers had a violent temper that only worsened with alcohol. Concerned for her safety, she confided in her family that she planned to ask him to leave. That conversation would be her last warning. On October 31st, 1995, Halloween night, Linda's family arrived at her home for a planned gathering. What they found instead was a nightmare. Linda had been stabbed to death and left in her bathtub. When detectives questioned the family, they all pointed to the same man, Glen Rogers. They knew him by name, and they knew Linda had planned to remove him from her life. When his name was entered into law enforcement databases, investigators discovered what they feared. Glen Rogers was already wanted for murder in California. Now, with a second woman dead and a cross-country fugitive on the loose, the manhunt for Glen Rogers was no longer a local search. It had become a national emergency. Just 5 days after the brutal murder in Van Nuys, California, Glen Rogers resurfaced, this time in Tampa, Florida. It was at a local bar that Rogers met 34-year-old Tina Marie Cribbs. The two shared drinks and casual conversation, and by the end of the evening, Rogers asked Tina for a ride back to his motel. She agreed. Tina drove a white Ford Festiva. The following morning, something odd happened. Rogers walked into the motel office and paid for an extra night, but soon after, the motel manager saw him loading his bags into Tina's white car and driving away. The scene felt off. Why pay for another night if he planned to leave? Rogers had also made a strange request. He didn't want anyone entering his room, not even housekeeping. But when checkout time came, and the Do Not Disturb sign was still hanging on the door, motel staff grew suspicious. Following protocol, a maid entered the room to clean. Inside the bathroom, she made a horrifying discovery. Tina Marie Cribbs was found lifeless in the bathtub. She had been stabbed to death. Investigators quickly tied the room rental to Glen Rogers. His pattern was becoming disturbingly clear. Charm, lure, kill, and then vanish. Detectives also noted a chilling detail. Rogers' victims often turned up in bathtubs. Authorities theorized he may have used running water in an attempt to wash away forensic evidence, his own twisted version of a cover-up. By now, the FBI had joined the hunt. Rogers was officially listed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, and his name spread like wildfire through national headlines. But Rogers wasn't done. After fleeing Florida, he traveled to Bossier City, Louisiana, where he reunited with a woman named Andy Giles Sutton. One report suggests they may have known each other previously. Andy had told friends she was happy to see him again. Glen Rogers didn't stay hidden for long. Just days after the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs in Florida, Rogers resurfaced in Bossier City, Louisiana, where he reconnected with Andy Giles Sutton, a woman he may have known from the past. Andy had told her friends how happy she was to see him again, but that joy would turn to tragedy. Late one night, Andy's roommate came home and heard the couple in their shared bedroom. Rather than disturb them, she decided to sleep on the couch. The next morning, after hearing nothing from the room, she knocked gently on the door. There was no answer. She opened it and made a horrifying discovery. Andy was lying on the bed, brutally slashed and lifeless. When investigators questioned the roommate, she identified Andy's new boyfriend by name, Glen Rogers. By this point, the manhunt for Rogers had become national. The FBI had zeroed in on Kentucky, suspecting he might attempt to contact family there. They were right. 4 days after Andy's murder, a family member in Kentucky dialed 911. Rogers had just visited her home, she said, and she provided police with the direction he was headed, along with the vehicle description, a small white car, which authorities knew had belonged to Tina Marie Cribbs. Soon after, a Kentucky State Police trooper spotted the car. A high-speed chase ensued. Rogers lost control and crashed into a ditch. It was over. News crews, tipped off to the pursuit, arrived just in time to broadcast the dramatic arrest live. Inside the car, crime scene technicians recovered bloody clothing and evidence linking Rogers to all 4 murders committed during his 6-week cross-country rampage. The states involved agreed that Florida would try Rogers first. 2 years after his arrest, Glen Rogers stood trial for the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Today, he remains on Florida's death row, with his execution scheduled for May 15th of this year. Following his Florida conviction, Rogers was temporarily transferred to California, where he was tried and convicted for the murder of Sandra Gallagher. There, too, he received another death sentence before being returned to Florida's death row. Other states declined to prosecute Rogers for the additional murders, since he had already received 2 death sentences. At least one report stated that Glen Rogers left behind 11 children without their mothers, a haunting reminder of the devastation left in his wake.